I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in episode 30 we follow up on the rise of the Franks under Charlemagne with the conquest of Barcelona and the formation of the Spanish March, and the society, culture, and economy of the Carolingian Empire. The Carolingian conquest of Barcelona. In episode 29, Charlemagne in Spain, we look at how the Franks conquered Girona and the Catalan and Aragonese Pyrenees, and how they intervened in the uprisings led by Muslim leaders in the Upper March against the Cordovan government throughout the 790s. Now it's time to explore the final phase of the Carolingian expansion into the Iberian Peninsula. In 798, King Louis the Pious of Aquitaine ordered the strengthening of fortifications along the Ter River in the county of Girona, and he instructed Count Borrell of Urgell and Cerdanya to seize and fortify Vic and Cardona, in what is now central Catalonia, as a preparatory step toward the conquest of Barcelona. There was an unsuccessful attempt to take Barcelona, and out of frustration over this failure, the Franks pushed as far as Lleida, which they set on fire, and they also plundered the area around Huesca. The final attempt to conquer Barcelona was carefully planned in Toulouse in the year 800, taking advantage of a civil war in the Emirate of Córdoba between Emir al-Hakam and his uncles. After the governor of Barcelona, Matru, died in Zaragoza, the already sparse Arab and Berber presence in the city was further diminished. Facing the advancing Franks, it appears that Governor Sadun al-Ruaini reached an agreement with Charlemagne to hand over the city in exchange for staying in power and receiving protection against Córdoba. However, after the harsh lesson of the 778 expedition, the Franks knew that the promises of governors in the Upper March were worthless, and they prepared to take Barcelona by force if Sadun reneged, which is exactly what happened. Anticipating this outcome, King Louis divided his army into three columns. The main force under his command remained in Roussillon as a reserve. The army led by Count William of Toulouse and the Count of Narbonne was tasked with confronting the Arab and Berber relief forces coming from Zaragoza, and the troops led by the Count of Girona carried out the siege. After defeating the reinforcements, William's forces were able to join the Count of Girona in the siege. Winter arrived and the siege dragged on, leading to severe hunger and demoralization among the people of Barcelona. Sadun tried to escape to request aid from Córdoba, but was caught by the Franks and executed. He was succeeded by a man named Harun, who was determined to defend Barcelona to the last man. The reserve forces, led by King Louis himself, arrived in early 801. Weeks passed, and as hunger and desperation consumed the city, a group of Hispanogoths captured Harun and handed him over to the Franks. This led to the surrender of Barcelona, allowing King Louis to enter the city in triumph on Easter Sunday. Despite the Christian conquest, documentary, toponymic, and onomastic evidence points to the continued existence of a small Muslim community in the Barcelona area after the conquest, even though Arabic sources state that they were given a year to live. Louis appointed Berat, the son of the powerful Count William of Toulouse, as the first Count of Barcelona and relocated the bulk of the Frankish garrison from Girona to Barcelona, as the city now took its place as the front line of defense along the southwestern border of the Carolingian Empire. In the 9th century, Barcelona was a small city with a late antique look, full of Christian buildings and open plots used as vegetable gardens within the city walls. Yeah, urban gardens are not a modern invention. Though it may be hard to imagine given how large the city is today, the Barcelona conquered by the Franks had an estimated population of about 1,500 residents within its walls, not much more than Girona at the time. There were no distinct artisan or Jewish quarters yet. Carolingian Barcelona had limited influence over surrounding areas, and we know that the castle of Olèrdola, about 60 kilometers or 37 miles south of Barcelona, marked the farthest frontier of Al-Andalus during the 9th century, making Carolingian Barcelona highly vulnerable to possible attacks from Muslim forces. The formation of the Spanish March. Although the conquest of Barcelona in 801 marks the end of Carolingian expansion into Hispania, it was not actually the final goal. Rather, it was an intermediate step toward the complete conquest of the Andalusi Upper March, or at the very least, the annexation of all territory on the right bank of the Ebro River. We know of 3 failed campaigns by Louis against Tortosa, a city near the mouth of the Ebro. For most of the Middle Ages, the Ebro Delta did not yet exist, and the nearby town of Amposta marked where the river met the sea. The first campaign in 804 resulted in the destruction of numerous fortresses and villages along the coast of Tarragona. This destructive activity was likely linked to the fact that the Tortosa area was a major hub for Andalusi pirates who attacked Christian coastal settlements throughout the Mediterranean. The second attempt in 808 ended in a Frankish military victory and the capture of Lut, but they still failed to take Tortosa. The final attempt came the following year, with the Franks laying full-scale siege to the city using siege engines. After 40 days, the most prominent Hispano-Gothic leaders of Tortosa surrendered the city's keys in a gesture of submission. However, frontier governors and the son and heir of Emir al-Hakam, who would later become Abdelrahman II, arrived with a relief army, defeated the attackers, and prevented the Frankish capture of Tortosa, which remained an Andalusia stronghold until the 12th century. An article by Josep Sunyer offers fascinating insight, emphasizing the key role of the local garrison and volunteer population in the defense of Tortosa. It highlights the involvement of Christians, Jews, Mualads, and sailors from disadvantaged backgrounds of various ethnic origins. In the Aragonese region, the Franks had not abandoned their aim of taking Huesca and made another attempt in 812, but it failed, marking the end of their efforts in the central Pyrenees. They did appear to have more success in Pamplona, where at the beginning of the 9th century, a Vasconic governor named Velasco remained loyal to the Franks. This Carolingian Pamplona was sustained more by diplomacy than by a strong Frankish presence. In 816, a war broke out in Vasconia to determine whether the region would fall more under Andalusi or Frankish influence. It ultimately leaned toward Al-Andalus, as we will see in another episode when we discuss the emergence of the Kingdom of Pamplona under Íñigo Arista. Given that continued expansion was proving difficult in the short term, the Carolingians and Umayyads signed a peace treaty that established the frontier between them at Barcelona. In exchange, the Franks gave up their claims to Tortosa and Zaragoza. This peace was short-lived, and in 815, Emir al-Hakam ordered his uncle Abdallah al-Balansi to attack Barcelona, though Canberra successfully defended the city. Before 820, a more lasting peace was established with Córdoba. This consolidated a border zone in the eastern half of Catalonia, what came to be known as Old Catalonia, comprising counties like Barcelona, Girona, Osona, and Empúries. Meanwhile, the Franks lost influence over Navarre and the Aragonese Pyrenean valleys, except for Ribagorza. To distinguish the territory controlled by the Carolingians from the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, some Frankish chroniclers refer to it as the Marca Hispanica, or Spanish March, or used other terms like Gothia. But as historian Ramon de Badal once pointed out, it's important to note that the Spanish March never existed as a unified administrative entity, nor was there any real sense of unity among the counties. Rather, it was simply a term for the collection of Carolingian frontier counties in what are now parts of Catalonia and Aragon. This is why some historians call it pre-Catalonia, because, just like the authors of the time, we are dealing with a political reality without precedent, and therefore difficult to name. The results of the Carolingian campaigns in Hispania can only be considered mixed, with both successes and failures. The frontier of the Spanish March and the future Catalan counties will remain largely unchanged for the next 3 centuries. Charlemagne, Emperor and Champion of Christendom. In the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor after Charlemagne had helped him return to Rome following his expulsion due to conflicts with the Roman aristocracy. According to the poet Einhard, Charlemagne didn't want to be crowned emperor, but this was likely a rhetorical device to portray Charlemagne as a humble man. In reality, it was Charlemagne who orchestrated the coronation. Charlemagne's elevation to emperor has been interpreted in many ways, for instance, as a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Byzantine Empire by laying claim to the Roman imperial legacy and the leadership of Christendom. However, contemporary documents suggest that Charlemagne himself didn't place as much importance on the title as we tend to today. Charlemagne's campaigns were not only about military expansion and plunder, they also had a religious dimension. The Pope justified the Carolingian campaigns in Al-Andalus as a holy war against infidels and as a mission to liberate and protect Christian communities oppressed by Arab rule. Of course, there is always a gap between rhetoric and reality, as we've already seen. The Franks had no qualms about making alliances with rebellious Muslim leaders in the Upper March, just as they did with Slavic princes and pagan Danish warlords. The religious aspect extended beyond warfare. The ecclesiastical, spiritual, and moral reforms promoted by Charlemagne and his son Louis must be seen as part of a utopian ideal of a society governed according to biblical principles. Ruling in a Christian manner was a serious political requirement in Carolingian culture. But even the champion of Latin Christendom couldn't escape the effects of age. By the time he was crowned emperor, Charlemagne was less active in military affairs and focused on intensive legislative work while delegating more authority to his three sons. As a result, the Carolingian Empire was divided among them in 806. However, since two of them died before him, Louis the Pious, king of Aquitaine, became Charlemagne's sole heir and succeeded him upon his death in 814. Charlemagne had succeeded in building the largest empire in Europe since the Roman Empire. For that reason, some call him the father of Europe, or at least one of its founding figures. Centuries after his death, Charlemagne remained a model to look up to for all rulers of Latin Christendom. Carolingian society and feudalism? How was the population organized, and how was Carolingian society structured? When did the manorial system begin? Can we even talk about feudalism in early medieval Christian Europe? I will answer these questions and more in this section, since it is essential for understanding the Carolingian world and for challenging some common misconceptions. Carolingian society, and early medieval European societies in general, was a society of social orders or estates, rather than castes or social classes. These social orders were recognized by the legal framework of the time and were determined by secular or ecclesiastical office or by birth. It's an anachronism to categorize early medieval European society based on profession or income. Instead, authority and rank, according to the law and based on political, military, or ecclesiastical roles, mattered far more. We also have to account for gender, religious belief, and other overlapping criteria when analyzing Carolingian social order, making it difficult to think of it as a simple, easy-to-understand hierarchy. Though in fairness, this kind of complexity is true of any society. Nothing is ever as simple as the classic pyramid chart suggests. From a medieval perspective, society was above all seen as Christian, and its social hierarchy was interpreted as a reflection of divine order, with each person having a specific place and role. This legitimized social hierarchies, but it also meant that each role, whether count or peasant, was to be respected, since everyone's task was necessary and all were equal before God. As we saw with Visigothic society, the most basic legal distinction in post-Roman societies was between free and unfree people, and between lords and serfs and slaves. A specific legal categories also existed for military personnel, public servants, and clergy, such as bishops, judges, or counts. The Carolingian world was dominated by aristocrats, and their status came from control over land and labor, horse ownership, client networks, extended family, and recognition through public office. In other words, as usual in a hierarchical society, nepotism and favoritism played a key role. Aristocrats displayed their elite status by carrying weapons, wearing military belts and special clothing, speaking refined Latin, and participating in war, hunting, and feasting. It's true that being born into the right family didn't guarantee success, nor did humble origins mean you couldn't advance. The aristocracy wasn't a closed caste. There was some social mobility. This mobility could come from merit, loyalty, royal favor, building client networks, marriage, or changes in wealth. A person of humble origin could be ennobled, while a rebellious noble could be executed, have their property confiscated, and bring disgrace to their family. Sources refer to aristocrats by title, using terms such as noble, powerful, close to the king, and excellent. The elite distinguished themselves not only by being free and influential in society and politics, but also by seeing themselves as morally superior to the peasant masses. In the aristocratic mindset, nothing was worse than disrupting the social order they controlled. This is evident in cases where Frankish and Saxon aristocrats massacred peasants who had defended their lands from Viking raids. What might be seen as a patriotic defense, perhaps even a civic duty, was perceived by the elite as a threat, because they wanted to prevent any self-managed armed peasant organization. The challenge to aristocratic authority was worse to them than the raids of pagan invaders who would loot, capture people, and leave. However, when we look at the rich Carolingian documentation, we see that Carolingian society doesn't generally fit the stereotype of the feudal lord ruling over peasant serfs from a large estate or castle, imposing arbitrary and abusive demands. First of all, land ownership was typically scattered, even among large and small landowners. Large estates concentrated under a single magnate's control were rare. A mid-level landowner might have a few plots in one village and a few more in nearby ones, often with ties to a higher status landowner with properties spread out more widely, perhaps an aristocrat with officially recognized authority under the Carolingians. In this way, Carolingian society was informally structured through client networks and growing social inequality. The most common form of settlement organization was in villages with small wooden homes to house nuclear families, typically a couple and 3 children. Farmland was usually located outside the village. Each family had a few hectares to cultivate, whether owned or rented from a landowner. During the post-Roman late antiquity, villages and isolated estates often appeared and disappeared. But starting in the Carolingian period, settlements became more permanent, especially if a cemetery or church had been built. Churches were increasingly built from stone instead of wood. Large aristocratic landowners often had multiple residences in cities, rural estates far from peasant villages, or monasteries founded by their families. They didn't live in a fixed, fortified location, but rather moved frequently to manage the scattered lands and fulfill obligations in the Carolingian Empire. The most powerful magnates employed local administrators or parish priests embedded in communities to manage their properties. Their connections to the Carolingian court or other magnates helped link villages with imperial administration and justice. The growing presence of the church, often thanks to aristocrats who founded churches controlled by their families, also connected villages politically and spiritually to the broader Carolingian world. It's worth noting that many church leaders came from the aristocracy and shouldn't be seen as entirely separate from the secular elite, although clergy did develop a distinct group identity. Most people were peasant serfs, not small freeholders, though free versus unfree wasn't black and white. There were subtle, informal degrees of freedom or dependency. The largest landowners were the Carolingian dynasty and the church, whose bishoprics and abbeys managed enormous estates, either purchased or donated by kings, aristocrats, and commoners. In the Carolingian heartlands, roughly between northern France and western Germany, the manorial system gained ground during the 8th and 9th centuries. A village will fall under the control of the king, an aristocrat, or a church institution. These manors included lands cultivated by serfs for the lord, while dependent peasants held other plots for subsistence, paying rent through labor, money, or goods. The manorial system has sparked much debate and has been central to the modern concept of feudalism. But can these manors be generalized for the Carolingian era? The evidence we have comes mainly from royal and ecclesiastical estates. This intensive exploitation to maximize land productivity was a royal initiative and extended to episcopal and monastic lands that enjoyed tax privileges in exchange for services to the king. In that sense, church property was also viewed as a kind of public resource. Therefore, we cannot generalize this manorial phenomenon from royal and ecclesiastical domains in the empire's political center as if it were the dominant way land was organized. Only the king, church institutions, or top imperial aristocrats could afford to buy and consolidate scattered properties, which were the norm, or to carry out extensive deforestation to convert unused land into farmland. This is one reason why we cannot accurately speak of feudalism in the early Middle Ages for most of Europe. But what is feudalism? There are many definitions and no consensus on whether it's even a useful framework. Broadly, feudalism is defined as the political, economic, and social system based on relationships of vassalage and dependence, where vassalage is an unequal relationship between two free men, and dependence is a servile relationship between a landowner and a non-free person. Some scholars trace this system back to the Carolingians, arguing that Carolingian kings built personal loyalty ties with aristocrats by granting them public offices. But counter-arguments point out that in Carolingian sources, vassals were individuals in the king's personal service. Not all court aristocrats were called vassals. There were no written oaths of loyalty, and the granting of income in the form of benefices linked to revocable office was neither the most common nor the most important path to land ownership. Aristocrats didn't usually grant land to their own followers either. The benefice, or fief, should be seen as an extra reward, and in any case, the Carolingian monarchs generally acknowledged the de facto social prominence of those they honored with public office. Their authority and influence didn't depend on receiving land as a fief. When people think of feudalism, they often imagine an oppressive system where secular and ecclesiastical magnates exploited dependent peasants with little oversight and operated autonomously from royal authority. Sometimes all of Christian medieval Europe is labeled feudal, but in the strictest sense, feudalism refers to the relationship between a king, a secular or church lord, and their loyal followers or vassals. Written loyalty oaths and defined mutual obligations only became widespread in the 11th century. Some historians distinguish between feudalism as a legal institutional concept, the formalization of loyalty ties, and feudalism as an economic system, referring to manorial land exploitation between lords and dependent peasants. The origins of that shift will be subject to further investigation, but it's generally explained as follows. As the Carolingian kingdom weakened in the late 9th century, aristocrats with public offices, such as dukes and counts, began treating institutions as personal property, making them hereditary and converting royal land into their own holdings. Gradually, dukes and counts became sovereigns in their own territories, controlling what were once public resources. They consolidated power and built their own client networks by rewarding their followers with fiefs in exchange for military service. In turn, these new subordinates had their own loyal dependents. This created a trickle-down effect, reinforcing major aristocratic lineages and a petty nobility, a process we can call the feudalization of society. The nature of Carolingian power. As a society dominated by an aristocracy and governed through patronage and client relationships, political power in the Carolingian world was inherently more informal than in modern states or the Roman imperial period. Whenever possible, the Carolingian Empire preferred negotiation and cooperation with the local elites of each region rather than imposing its will through force or replacing local hierarchies with Frankish loyalists. Spiritually, his legitimacy came from his alliance with the Pope in Rome, God's representative on earth, and from his role in promoting and protecting a society ordered according to biblical principles. Issues of succession and the division of power were constant in the Carolingian world due to the patrimonial conception of kingship, which contrasted with the idea of an indivisible and public estate. As a result, kingdoms were conveniently created and dissolved, or the empire itself partitioned. Tonsuring a potential heir, meaning shaving their head like a monk, was one method of denying their royal ambitions, as was done among the Visigoths. However, neither tonsure nor illegitimacy was always sufficient to block those ambitions, and some still became king despite such obstacles. Most daughters of Carolingian kings ended up in convents to prevent an excess of sons-in-law who might claim dynastic rights. Yet, by the end of the 9th century, this policy had created such a shortage of heirs that the dynasty's continuation was at risk. On the other hand, aristocratic power was legitimized by its association with royal power, which in turn was intertwined with ecclesiastical authority. The monarchy depended on the aristocracy to effectively govern the empire. The relationship between king and aristocracy should not be viewed as a zero-sum game, where one side's gain meant the other's loss. Rather, both needed each other, and it was understood that the king sought consensus and shared his power with the counts and bishops of the empire. Just as the Carolingian dynasty had its internal rivalries, the aristocracy was never a unified body either. Each member had different interests depending on their personal circumstances. So why did the Carolingian Empire lose momentum and ultimately dissolve? A key reason lies in the fact that its political and military structure was geared toward territorial expansion and warfare. It's an age-old political tactic to wage offensive campaigns and conquests to identify an external enemy, keep elites busy, reward them with war booty, and reduce the likelihood of civil war. Carolingian propaganda justified wars on religious grounds to spread Christianity among pagans, and, as with most empires, claimed a civilizing mission. While it's important not to be cynical and deny that many people of the time genuinely believed in spreading Christianity and saving souls, I personally think material gains were more influential, since war created enrichment opportunities for the royal family, the aristocracy, and others. We saw a similar dynamic in episode 16, how Leovigild built the Visigothic kingdom, when discussing the motivations behind Leovigild's campaigns. The capture of the treasure of the Avars, for example, brought immense wealth to the Carolingian Empire and gave Charlemagne greater flexibility to reward the most prominent aristocrats and the church. But as opportunities for conquest, large spoils, and social mobility began to diminish, so did the nobles' willingness to participate in campaigns or contribute men. This is why, by the end of Charlemagne's reign, more legislation was passed to encourage military levies. With fewer economic gains and offices to distribute, the pie got smaller, and discontented magnates, usually with a Carolingian claimant as figurehead, had greater incentive to revolt. These rebellions operated within the system, rather than seeking to overthrow it entirely. Like many empires before it, the Carolingian Empire thrived despite setbacks, while it could channel its military power outward. But once it reached the limits of expansion and began suffering external attacks, internal problems worsened. Another contributing factor to the empire's collapse was the fragile balance between imperial unity and the lack of standardized institutions or political centralization across its diverse regions, typical of European medieval governance. This flexibility had both advantages and drawbacks. On one hand, it allowed for the maintenance of disparate regions with distinct histories and cultures, while spreading a shared political and ecclesiastical culture that endured after independence. On the other hand, this flexibility and adaptation to local realities meant the Carolingian Empire lacked cohesion, which could easily lead to its political fragmentation. Ironically, those more responsible for the fall of the Carolingian Empire were not separatist regional elites, but members of the dynasty itself, whose internal rivalries undermined unity. Environmental history and the Carolingian economy. Let's go back in time and picture the European landscape during the early Middle Ages. You have to imagine a landscape dominated by forests, with forested areas covering between 40 and 80% of the land. For comparison, today in Spain, forests cover more than 37% of the territory, and in some parts of Europe, the percentage is below 15%. And that's despite technological advances that have reduced the amount of land needed for agriculture. Humans had to struggle against nature to survive, fighting off wolves that roam the early medieval European forests, dealing with locust plagues, floods, and droughts, while also trying to dominate and reshape nature to better serve their needs. The geographical reality of each region and the cultural or socioeconomic dietary preferences dictated how natural resources were exploited. For example, in Northern Europe, more meat was consumed than in the Mediterranean, and elites preferred to eat bread, meat, and wine because they were seen as markers of civilization. According to the theory of the four humors, which was widespread in both the Arab and European worlds to explain how the human body worked, bread was the only cereal considered both warm and moist, the combination believed to be the most desirable and beneficial for the body. Peasants grew and consumed cereals, which were cheap and calorie-dense, but bread consumption among the lower classes were less common. It was often eaten as a type of porridge. It was common for peasants to own some livestock, such as pigs, sheep, or goats, either for their own consumption or for feeding the elites, and to use their manure to fertilize crops. In regions where aristocrats exercise greater control, dependent peasants focus more heavily on cereal production and raising select animals, often at the cost of a less varied and balanced diet and a greater risk of suffering from bad harvests. Over centuries, starting around the year 800 and intensifying during the High Middle Ages, held by the medieval warm period, the European landscape changed significantly due to human activity, with widespread deforestation to convert unused land into farmland. The Carolingian Empire, like other European regions, experienced economic growth during this time, just as the Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire did. Economic activity gradually increased thanks to expanded agricultural exploitation, not only through the creation of new arable land across Europe, but also through investment in infrastructure like water mills that boosted productivity. This laid the foundation for a slow demographic expansion starting in the 9th century, which continued until the outbreak of the Black Death in the 14th century. That doesn't mean there weren't economic or demographic setbacks in the meantime due to cyclical crises like bad harvest or epidemics typical of pre-industrial economies, or due to political causes such as civil wars and Viking attacks in the mid-9th century, but the general trend was upward. As with most pre-industrial economies, agriculture was the main engine of the Carolingian economy. But is it fair to call it an autarkic economy based solely on subsistence farming? That's a more nuanced question. Although long-distance trade was limited, there are clear signs of thriving local and regional trade and of surplus goods being sold in markets. Compared to the economy of the Visigothic kingdom, the Carolingian economy was notably more dynamic and market-oriented. It's difficult to compare it to the Roman economy, which had a clear center-periphery structure where much trade revolved around Italy's needs, something the Carolingian Empire lacked. For that reason, instead of talking about a singular Carolingian economy, it might be more accurate to speak of Carolingian economies, because, as previously mentioned, the Carolingian Empire was poorly integrated, and its economy as a whole did not revolve around the political center in the Frankish heartlands. Each region had its own local economy, and the major trade routes of the North Sea, the Adriatic Sea, or Western Europe were not tightly interconnected. This had some benefits. Many regions were largely self-sufficient, and crises in one area didn't automatically become empire-wide political problems. Unlike in the Roman Empire, where a poor harvest or revolt in the grain-producing provinces of Egypt or Tunisia could cause major instability. Despite agriculture carrying the most economic weight, let's delve into trade and craftsmanship in the Carolingian world. Beyond agricultural and population growth, one political measure that helped revive local and regional trade was the increased monetization of the economy through the minting of silver coins. Kings and moneyers profited from this coinage, and replacing the gold coins of the Merovingian period with silver coins enabled everyday transactions and the emergence of markets and periodic fairs across the empire. Most trade occurred over land. Many Roman roads remained in use, though some fell into disrepair, and new ones were built during the Carolingian period. This was especially true in the Alps of northern Italy, where constant movement of people for military purposes, pilgrimage to Rome, or trade required new infrastructure like bridges, horse stables with postal services, inns, and monasteries that assisted travelers. There was even an attempt to construct a canal linking the Rhine and the Danube, though it appears it was never completed. Trade was frequently conducted not by professional merchants seeking profit, but by consumers and producers themselves, buying and selling out of necessity and without intermediaries. It's true that long-distance trade in the 8th and 9th century wasn't at its height. For instance, the Mediterranean trade in species and silk with Asia couldn't compare with Roman times. though commercial activity in the North Sea had increased. Even if we lack extensive documentation on long-distance transactions, we know from political travels and pilgrimages that the infrastructure existed for both land and sea-based commercial journeys. Carolingian markets received spices, silks, glassware, and gold from the Arab and Islamic world. But what did Europeans export? They exported Europeans. That's right. Besides weapons and furs, one of the most significant exports was European slaves. It was a highly profitable business, mostly oriented toward export rather than internal demand within the Carolingian Empire. After the last wave of bubonic plague ravaged the Middle East and North Africa during the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus, the Islamic world faced a labor shortage. As I mentioned earlier, Islamic piracy emerged along Christian Mediterranean coasts, targeting the highly valuable commodity of slaves for military, agricultural, and domestic use. But Christian Europeans also sold slaves to Arabs and North Africans, including in Al-Andalus. Slaves were usually captured in military campaigns or kidnapped. There are known cases of Christians enslaving other Christians, and one could become a slave as punishment for a crime, by being abandoned or sold as a child, by being born to a slave mother, or even voluntarily to pay off debts. The slave markets were flooded in the second half of the 9th century due to Charlemagne's campaigns against the pagan Saxons and Slavs. In fact, the word slave derives from Slav because so many Eastern Europeans were enslaved. The sale of Christians to Muslim infidels caused outrage among some clergy, leading even the Pope to shut down the slave market in Rome in 748 and free many who were about to be sold by Venetian merchants to Africa. Nevertheless, the slave trade continued, and some slave traders of Frankish, Venetian, Jewish, and even Andalusi origin were protected by commercial privileges granted by Emperor Louis the Pious himself. In a way, Europe helped finance part of the Islamic world's economic growth, which was desperate for labor after the last bubonic plague outbreak in the 740s. Meanwhile, many individuals from Europe and nascent merchant republics like Venice or Amalfi grew rich from that slave trade, which persisted throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern era. This dynamic was a double-edged sword, since it strengthened Arab armies and encouraged Viking and Muslim raids in the 9th century. After all, why should Scandinavians or Muslims pay Christian middlemen for slaves when they could raid the Carolingian Empire and reap large profits themselves? Moving beyond trade, unlike in later centuries during Carolingian times, more artisanal production of textiles, tools, weapons, or ceramics occurred in rural areas and lay or ecclesiastical manors rather than in towns and cities. Many artisans worked in monasteries, and they were not considered free professionals as they often are depicted in narratives about later medieval society. Instead, they were dependent on the monastery. The same was true for many merchants who worked for monasteries or for large landowners, sometimes as professional traders, other times as people whose usual occupation wasn't commerce, but who were temporarily tasked with serving as state agents. Textiles were often woven by peasant women as a supplementary activity, either for their own use or for sale. And weaving could also serve as a social or leisure activity when women gathered to talk while they worked. In a more autarkic economy than a market-driven one, the production of everyday items such as dishes, spoons, barrels, or torches was typically a secondary activity of peasants, often because these goods were demanded by lords as part of the rent and duties owed by serfs. Therefore, in Christian Europe during the early Middle Ages, most artisans weren't located in cities or in distinct guild quarters. They were bound to magnates, and many artisanal tasks were carried out by peasants as secondary work rather than by specialists. The Carolingian Renaissance. The larger a kingdom or empire becomes, the more necessary the written word is to manage affairs of a state. This is one of the key reasons behind what is known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Just as the Spanish Empire, which later founded more universities than any other power in the Americas, did to support its vast bureaucratic needs. However, the Carolingian Renaissance cannot be explained solely by the pragmatic use of writing for imperial administration or by a king's desire to gain prestige as a patron of the arts and letters. It also stemmed from a genuine concern with reforming and correcting society and transforming it into a righteous Christian one. That's why synods were convened and theologians promoted to define Christian orthodoxy and heresy, and why investment was made in the education of parish-level clergy to better transmit Christianity. Schools were founded for both clergy and lay elites, literacy increased, scriptoria and libraries were established and expanded, and a new, more legible and quicker to write script, the Carolingian mini-school, was developed and spread throughout the Carolingian Empire to standardize and simplify reading. Rome was synonymous with civilization, and the Franks consciously revived and imitated Roman liturgy and cultural elements, such as classical Latin writing, as opposed to the emerging Romance languages, which were increasingly diverging from Vulgar Latin. Knowledge was valued as a way to draw closer to God. Like Visigothic culture before it, Carolingian culture was ecclesiastical, and nearly all intellectuals were connected to the church in some way. Their interest, therefore, focused on theology, spirituality, and morality, while attention to fields like mathematics and astronomy was limited to calculating key Christian calendar dates. A particularly popular literary genre was exegesis, the critical interpretation of parts of the Bible, driven by the monastic pursuit of answers about the earthly and divine worlds or morality through sacred texts. Another popular genre was hagiography, biographies of saints that often included mystical and fantastical elements such as miracles. There was a strong focus on correct liturgical practice, on performing rites and ceremonies properly, and on transmitting hymns and sermons in writing. Clergy exchanged letters, debated, and posed theological questions to fellow men of God. While some scholars debate whether the term Carolingian Renaissance is appropriate, there is no doubt that a true Renaissance took place in poetry, which had nearly disappeared in the late Roman period. In Carolingian times, it resurged with epic, biblical, courtly, and even humorous poems, not to mention liturgical hymns composed to be sung. Treatises on grammar and rhetoric, medicine, agronomy, and other sciences were written, drawing on Greek and Roman traditions, and copies of major works of late antique intellectuals such as Augustine of Hippo, Isidore of Seville, and the Anglo-Saxon Bede circulated widely. Works or fragments of classical authors continued to be passed down, often filtered through Christian commentary and compilations, including the grammars of Aelius Donatus and Priscian, and the rhetorical works of Cicero, texts essential for teaching refined Latin in clerical and aristocratic schools. The so-called Carolingian Renaissance was not a bottom-up cultural movement. It was a deliberately promoted program initiated at the Carolingian court, which employed numerous ecclesiastical intellectuals. Some of the most prominent among them included Alcuin of York, Paulinus of Aquileia, Peter of Pisa, Paul the Deacon, Rabanus Maurus, Einhard, and Theodulf of Orleans, the latter of Iberian origin. Carolingian culture's renewed emphasis on writing extended beyond laws or great literary and encyclopedic works to much more practical needs, such as state management, records, contracts of sale, and property disputes. Thanks to this appreciation for the written word, we have far more documents from early medieval Catalonia than from other Christian kingdoms and counties not of Carolingian origin. The Carolingian Renaissance influenced writing, production, but also architecture and art, seen in chapel domes, frescoes, illuminated scripts, and music. Perhaps even more important is that the cultural flourishing extended beyond Charlemagne's reign and left a lasting legacy that survived the Carolingian dynasty itself.
The verdict.
In today's verdict, I want to briefly reflect on how surprised I have been by the topic of slavery during the Carolingian period, especially in helping understand certain historical developments that otherwise seem inexplicable. While we should never forget that the backbone of medieval wealth was agriculture, we also can ignore the disproportionate impact that the slave trade had and its long-term consequences. I had known about the enslaving campaigns led by Charlemagne against pagan peoples, but I was unaware that, beyond cultural differences, the rising demand for slaves in the Islamic world was also tied to demographic losses from the bubonic plague. I also hadn't considered that this slave trade with the Islamic world could have been so central to the development of maritime republics, like Venice, What especially surprised me was Michael McCormick's convincing explanation that the Viking and Muslim raids of the 9th and 10th centuries must be understood in the context of this slave trade and the competition to monopolize it. Otherwise, there is no compelling reason to explain why these raids began when they did and not earlier. When we think about slavery, our minds usually jump to the transatlantic slave trade of black Africans in the early modern era. But the truth is that slavery, regardless of the enslaved person's ethnicity, has unfortunately been a central part of many economies since antiquity. We cannot ignore that reality, nor the fact that some cities, regions, and countries owe their current economic positions to the profits of that human trafficking. And with that, the verdict ends. Before you go, be sure to like, comment, and share to help with the algorithm if you are watching on YouTube. Subscribe on podcast directories or YouTube. I recommend the latter, where you will find additional content beyond this chronological series. Moreover, you can support my work and get exclusive benefits, like early access or be mentioned in an episode at patreon.com/newhistoryspain. In the next episode, we will return to the political history of Al-Andalus with emirs Hisham I and Al-Hakam I, as well as the early years of the reign of Alfonso II of Asturias. Thanks for listening, and see you soon!